Okay, let's start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And a very welcome to all of you who have joined from different parts of the world. My name is Rodolfo.
Bonjour, Carla. C'est Alex.
I am the Environment Director at the OECD. My name is Rodolfo Lassi. Someone was talking besides me. But I would like to thank you for joining us today for this virtual global conference on biodiversity finance. This conference has been organized jointly with the OECD Biodiversity Land Use and Ecosystems Blue program. That's the name of the program we have here. And the UNDP Biodiversity Finance Initiative, we call it BioFin. I'm very pleased that we have joined forces to enable this conference to take place despite this difficult time we find ourselves in. As many of you know, we planned to convene this conference here at Paris as a milestone in the lead up to CBD COP15, but have had to postpone the physical meeting due to the COVID-19. And allow me to highlight that the strong link between the pandemic's origins and biodiversity loss is worrying. Human interference with natural systems, in particular the destruction of natural habitat and wild animal trade, has increased human contact with wildlife, which in turn increases exposure and human to virus-carrying animals. So this connection very important in this context. For now, we are conducting this global conference on biodiversity finance virtually over a period of 3 weeks on Wednesday, April 15, 22, and 29. The objectives of this virtual series are therefore first, to examine trends and lessons learned in scaling up biodiversity finance and policy incentives. Second, to foster exchange among governments and biodiversity finance experts of experiences, best practices, and opportunities for mobilizing, tracking, and aligning biodiversity finance. And third, to reflect our recommendations on biodiversity finance for the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That's the most important part, in my opinion. Just some logistics to start off with. For those not familiar with Zoom, I need to emphasize that if you have any trouble connecting, please contact Nacera. For those already online, please switch your microphone to mute to prevent background noise. And we also invite you to rename yourself if necessary, so we know who you are. Please add your first name, last name, and country or organization as the name I have here on my screen. If you would like to ask a question, please click on the chat function on the bottom of your screen and type a question. You can also raise your hand, and to do this, click in the participation function on the bottom of your screen. You also can give some likes and applause if you like the presentations that we have for you today. It is my pleasure to moderate this first part of the session where we have a distinguished high-level panel. This will cover opening remarks from both the OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria and the UNDP Administrator Akin Steiner. They pre-recorded videos and you will see them. And will be followed by 2 keynote speeches from France and Seychelles. And it is my honor to welcome with us today Bonpoisson. She is the Secretary of State to the Minister of the Ecological and Inclusive Transition in France. It's a very nice and comprehensive name for the ministry. And Alain de Combarment, he is the Principal Secretary in the Environment Department in Seychelles. So welcome, Arun and Alain, to this conference. Now, let me ask for the videos. Please load the 2 videos and we will see them.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual global conference on biodiversity finance. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank UNDP for our strong collaboration. This joint meeting by the UNDP's Biodiversity Finance Initiative, BioFin, and the OECD's Biodiversity, Land Use and Ecosystems Program, BLUE, will be critical in sharing experiences and insights on how to scale up biodiversity finance. Today's COVID-19 global crisis is a stark reminder of the complex links between the transmission of infectious diseases and biodiversity. In fact, biodiversity loss is associated with the transmission or the severity of disease for a range of pathogens, while land conversion, as well as the wildlife trade, bring more people into contact with potentially new diseases. And biodiversity loss continues. Around 1 million species already face extinction, with extinction rates at between tens to hundreds of times greater than over the past 10 million years. Safeguarding biodiversity can help reduce future health risks, making our societies more resilient. But the benefits of biodiversity go far beyond disease protection, contributing to global public goods. By managing ecosystems of agricultural landscapes and maintaining the richness of tropical forests, we ensure greater carbon sequestration and global genetic diversity. It is estimated that marine and terrestrial ecosystems sequester in gross terms the equivalent of 60% of human carbon dioxide emissions. 60%. This is why we need to move towards an ambitious, effective, post-2020 global biodiversity framework under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. The implementation of this framework, however, requires adequate financial resources, a higher volume of resources, and more effective finance solutions are indispensable. Building on lessons learned to date, we have the opportunity today and over the course of the following weeks to reflect on how to further scale up and further improve the effectiveness of biodiversity finance. The OECD has been focusing on aligning these efforts to achieve our finance ambitions. Let me briefly provide you a few key examples. First, it is important to start with the state of play of global biodiversity finance. At the request of the G7 environment ministers, we have just released a new report entitled A Comprehensive Overview of Biodiversity Finance. This report estimates that biodiversity finance it's about 78 to 91 billion per year. Second, data availability, data comparability remain critical. The OECD tracks consistent data across countries, which includes monitoring progress towards the Aichi targets on positive incentives and resource mobilization. Biodiversity relevant taxes, for example, generate at least $7.5 billion a year. And we're proud to work with a range of countries beyond our membership in these efforts. And by the way, we encourage others to contribute to our databases. If we do it together, we'll do it better. Third, we have been establishing partnerships such as the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting. It focuses on directly supporting governments in aligning their national budgets with biodiversity, climate, and other environmental objectives. And last but not least, our actions going forward will be futile without the reform of public spending that harms biodiversity. We need more ambitious, better aligned policies to protect biodiversity. Today, government support to fossil fuels, to agricultural practices, fisheries practices that are potentially harmful to biodiversity is many times larger than the total finance flows to protect biodiversity. It's an enormous paradox. It's an enormous contradiction. In all of this, our efforts will be ineffective if we do not ensure our policies and actions protect the most vulnerable households and the most vulnerable communities, and that they stand to gain from these reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 is a powerful messenger with a powerful message. The message is our system is broken and we cannot go back to business as usual. We need to build new economic systems that value nature as a central source of our health and our well-being. Let's remember the words of Johan Rockström. I quote, "The value of biodiversity is that it makes our ecosystems more resilient, which is a prerequisite for stable societies. Its wanton destruction is akin to setting fire to our lifeboat," unquote. I wish you all an excellent conference. Thank you.
Now let's hear Achim Steiner. Video, please.
I would like to warmly welcome you to this virtual global conference on biodiversity finance. It is being organized online in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic is one of the greatest challenges that the world has faced since the Second World War. The COVID-19 pandemic is much more than a health crisis. It has the potential to create devastating social, economic, environmental, and political crises at the global country and community level that will leave deep scars, including on our own world. This crisis may detract government's attention temporarily away from environmental issues, including our nature and climate crises. At the same time, the COVID-19 crisis has shown the value that the international community brings to the global response to crises that know no borders. that require action beyond national interests, such as our efforts to protect biodiversity. That includes partnerships like the one between UNDP and the OECD to support countries to ensure that adequate financial resources are channeled in the right direction to safeguard biodiversity ecosystem services and our natural world, in ways that also advance the 2030 agenda. The partnership is really about unlocking the massive finance opportunities out there. For instance, look at the recent analysis by the Food and Land Coalition, which shows that changes to the way we farm and feed ourselves can unlock up to 4.5 trillion in new business opportunities each year by the year 2030. At the same time, those changes could save us 5.7 trillion a year in damage to both people and planet. And there are many innovative financing efforts that are spurring positive change. For instance, South Africa has established tax deductions for the creation and management of new protected areas. And the Seychelles has also established financial incentives to support the tourism sector to transition to a fully sustainable model. Indeed, it has established the first ever biodiversity finance unit in the world. But it is data from 30 countries implementing BioFin that has shown that the level of conservation efforts needed cannot be accomplished with the current levels of finance. And it's simply not about creating new financing mechanisms. It is about eliminating and repurposing negative financing. It is also about increasing the efficiency of existing financing. Indeed, biodiversity finance involves over 150 different mechanisms as described in the BioFin catalog. Public budgets, subsidies, fees, fines, tax breaks, debt swaps, green bonds, fintech, and lotteries are all examples of how countries can reduce the gaps in their biodiversity finance. We need to connect all of these finance mechanisms within national finance plans embedded within the broader framework of SDG financing. However, many global events scheduled during this super year for nature to shape the post-2020 global biodiversity framework are now being postponed. We need to use this additional time to put in place the most optimal global biodiversity framework for the coming decade that revolves around finance. We also need to ensure that the post-COVID-19 economic and social recovery efforts are oriented towards green stimuli that accelerate biodiversity conservation. Without redirecting financing flows from nature negative to nature positive investments, nature will continue to be destroyed and biodiversity loss will continue, with devastating consequences for our communities, societies, and economies. So finance can no longer be an afterthought or simply perceived as a cross-cutting issue. Finance has to be at the very foundation of the new global biodiversity framework. You are playing a vital role in making this a reality. And I would like to thank you for your continued efforts in this crucial area.
Okay, thank you very much. Now it is the time to pass the floor to Brun Poisson. Please, Brun Poisson, could you give us some thoughts about the connection between biodiversity and finance?
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Thank you also to the OECD and to the UNDP for organizing this conference, for actually making sure that it takes place despite the crisis and what's happening at domestic and national levels. I think this is a very good signal, and that this is extremely important to keep talking about it and find an increasing number of solutions and have a large number of debates to make sure that we put the issue of biodiversity conservation at the heart of the recovery plans. So thank you very much to the OECD and to the UNDP. Obviously, just like Angel and Akim said, I think we should use this opportunity, we should use the crisis as an opportunity to rethink our global system and to really recall the vital role that biodiversity can play in helping us achieve a more resilient societies. And I think also it is particularly important to do that now, because it seems that now more than ever, the population and people have and see the links between health, their day-to-day lives, and biodiversity preservation. So in France, what we have decided to do is to keep pushing for biodiversity preservation and to make sure that it remains at the center of our climate, environmental, and even economic agenda. So, for example, we are deeply, and this is under the leadership of the OECD Paris Collaborative Green Budgeting, we are committed to green budgeting practices, and the 2021 budget will actually be submitted to a comprehensive environmental assessment to measure not only our efforts in favor of biodiversity, but to also understand and identify and fight against possible unfavorable side effects on biodiversity of other public expenditure and to reduce those impacts in the longer term. We believe this is a huge step forward, and through the collaborative that we're working on with the OECD, we would like to have an increasing number of countries actually join the efforts. What we're also doing at the domestic level is that we are changing a bit our ESG legislation to include and disclose and to ask companies to disclose more information on biodiversity and nature and exposure to those risks into investment strategies. Second of all, what I believe is critical is also financing biodiversity's conservation that will require really a change of scale and methods to allow a redirection of financial flows in favor of biodiversity. I strongly believe that biodiversity is really the new frontier of sustainable finance. Biodiversity loss is clearly a systemic risk, and we need to take it into account through, and we need to create the same sort of mobilization of the financial community as we managed to achieve. It's never enough, obviously, but it is still, there is a mobilization around climate change. I think we need to work closely to bring the climate change and biodiversity agenda closer together to learn from one another, because they're really the same side, the two faces, sorry, of the same coin. So this is why I could not underestimate and underemphasize the importance of the work of the OECD. Thank you again, Rodolfo, for the tremendous work that you've been doing. I know Angel Gurria has just mentioned the report, your report, a comprehensive overview of global biodiversity finance. If those of you who are attending the conference online have a bit of spare time, I'm sure you already have, but please do spend some time reading it. It was absolutely instrumental to our work within the framework of the G7 meeting that took place last year in France, and it really helps lay the groundwork for biodiversity finance. Angel Gurria has emphasized the gap between what we need in terms of investment for biodiversity and what is actually invested in it. And there is a set of policy recommendations in the report that we should absolutely carry forward. France fully endorses the recommendation of the report, and we want to really help build an international coalition on financial risks linked to nature. What we are also, and I think the first recommendations could be made during the next and the upcoming IUCN Congress, and I will come back to this Congress in a few seconds. I also asked, and the President Macron has also asked the One Planet Lab members to come up with concrete projects, coalitions of viable investments in nature. We have also put together a high-level, high-ambition coalition for nature and people, together with Costa Rica, that we launched during the pre-COP last year. I think we need to keep pushing for that. Perhaps to conclude, I would say that if 2020 can potentially at first sight look like a very disappointing year for biodiversity because so little is happening, because, formally, because most events have been postponed. I still think, just like Akin Steiner said, that it buys us also a bit of time to start building or to keep building strong coalitions and a new set of innovation. And I think of innovation for biodiversity and for finance, biodiversity finance. So the summit of the UN in September can hopefully kickstart a whole new process and a whole process in the light and in the framework of the COVID-19 crisis to really accelerate all the work that we've been doing at the international level on biodiversity finance. The IUCN Congress, which was originally planned to take place in June this year in Marseille in France, is actually postponed and will take place early January in France as well. After that, the General Assembly of UN Environment will take place in Nairobi in February. After that, there will be the COP15. And after that, obviously, a set of events that will lead to the COP26. So I think these events are also tremendous opportunities for us to keep working from now and September and then later on January to push this agenda forward. Please rest assured that France is fully committed to doing as much as we can to push that issue. More than ever, I think citizens are aware of the links between biodiversity and health. So this is the time, it's now or never. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the conference.
Thank you very much, Brune. It is true that we will have our super year in 2021.
Exactly.
We will define the new environment targets next year for climate, for biodiversity, water, chemicals, waste.
Absolutely. Waste and chemicals. Yeah.
For the following 10 years. So thank you very much for being with us. Now it is the time to pass the floor to Alain de Combaron. He is the Principal Secretary of Environment Department in Seychelles. Please, Alain.
Thank you very much. A good day to everybody. It's a pleasure on behalf of the government of Seychelles to join you all for this global virtual conference on biodiversity financing. It's a world first, and then again, I think it shows clearly the commitment by everybody to keep the momentum going whilst we face the crisis that we're in reference to COVID-19. It is a pleasure of mine to share our experience in reference to financing of biodiversity, especially in reference to the implementation of the Biofin project. And for Seychelles, as you all know, is considered as a biodiversity hotspot in the world. And we've put a lot of effort over the years in terms of our conservation policy, as well as sustainable development, to ensure that there's the right balance between conservation of the environment as well as development, especially tourism and fisheries development. And to date, we're very proud of our statistics and our achievements. Over 80% of our land is forested areas. Over 48% is protected terrestrially. And only last month, we achieved 30% designation of marine protected areas out of our EZ of 1.3 million square kilometers. So whilst we are very proud of these, however, the challenge in reference to financing and the necessary resources in ensuring and maintaining and sustaining these achievements and effort remains a big challenge. And for us, of course, we are guided by several national plans, amongst which is our National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, our NBSAP, for the last 5 years, which through the Biofin project was costed at around 320 million rupees, which is approximately 23 million US dollars. And we've been blessed over the years to have benefited greatly from different, obviously, financial sources and support from the EU, from the World Bank, from the GEF. However, circumstances are, even before the present crisis of COVID-19, and with Seychelles also recent graduation to high-income developing country status, the need is even greater to look more nationally, domestically, in terms of available resources and options, solutions to obtain more resources and financing for biodiversity conservation. And this is where biofin comes in. And Seychelles was one of the first countries, amongst one of the first 30 countries to participate in the biofin project. And we saw the biofin project as the ideal opportunity to take stock of where we were in reference to financing for biodiversity conservation, biodiversity management, in line with what we're striving upon, our conservation targets, our protection targets, both terrestrially as well as on marine side. And the process in itself, the biofin process is unique in itself, with the methodologies and guidelines and protocols and workbooks that were developed to run us through a long process. For us, we started the process back in 2014, and we finally presented the result to our Cabinet of Ministers last year, in 2019. So a long process of 5 years of extensive but in-depth consultation with relevant stakeholders from across different sectors: tourism, fisheries, biosecurity, and others. And it was a process whereby we looked at the baseline, where we are, very importantly to know, obviously, where we have to go in the future, looking at challenges ahead. So we did different reviews, the institutional and policy reviews, the budgetary expenditure review, which led us to, obviously, what were the financial needs for Seychelles moving forward with our goals. I just mentioned the 30% protection of our EZ, a huge space, over 400,000 square kilometers of sea. So this will require a lot of resources moving forward in terms of implementation of these protected areas. So this process has allowed us to do a very good reflection, not only through between government, but also, most importantly, the need to have all relevant stakeholders, from NGOs, from different sectors, but also private sector themselves, especially in fisheries and tourism, whereby they had a direct input in overseeing all these studies and review, which eventually led us to what we call today a biofin finance plan, a biodiversity finance plan for the country, where we started with over 34 finance solutions, ideas, propositions from what we have at this present time in terms of financial incentives, taxes, opportunities with the private sector, innovative sources of financing externally, existing practices with the private sector, which can be further encouraged so that biodiversity benefits. So it was a very, very extensive process, whereby eventually we narrowed down from 34 to 3 finance solutions. And this was, again, decided by stakeholders themselves. We agreed on three areas, which was mainly tourism. As you know, tourism as a small island developing state, like many others, Seychelles relies on tourism heavily as part of its economic power. So tourism remains our number one pillar. And we felt that tourism had the opportunity to contribute a bit more towards biodiversity conservation. We have over 300,000 tourists coming to our shores every single year, sorry. So it was important that we capture this and work with the sector to see how they can contribute towards more biodiversity conservation and action on the ground, so that eventually the sector benefits. And secondly, we had the biosecurity issue. We agreed, and more with opening of the economy, with globalization, biosecurity remains a top priority, especially for small islands, which relies a lot of outside trade coming in. So it was decided that biosecurity was one of the key areas whereby we have to focus. By having a very strong biosecurity system, this will ensure biodiversity conservation and security moving forward. And it was agreed on several measures in terms of how to raise more resources from the different regulation and permits with biodiversity to have some more contribution into the sector so that eventually biodiversity will benefit. And then last year was conservation and waste management, equally very important. This was one of the other areas that was decided. Seychelles, as a small island developing state, the environment, biodiversity is key to our survival. It's key to our economic development. And obviously this would have been an automatic choice in regards to moving forward, looking at ways at which we can raise financing for biodiversity. And the solutions themselves vary in nature. From Achim Steiner mentioned about incentives to the tourism sector, whereby we are proposing to give incentives, tax breaks to tourism establishments, especially hotels, who invest in conservation programs, also invest in staffing in reference to conservation, having staff who are dedicated on a day-to-day basis in doing conservation work within these hotel establishments. And also within the Seychelles tourism policy, we have a green label called the Seychelles Sustainability Label, tourism label. And this was seen as one of the other opportunities moving forward, how to engage more with the private sector, the tourism sector, to gain more from them in reference to their contribution to biodiversity conservation, but also in reference to energy, waste management issues. Another area also which we discussed lengthily, obviously, was regards to contribution by the private sector on the community, the CSR tax, social responsibility tax, which of course was being shared amongst many sectors. But the project itself called for more contribution towards biodiversity by especially the tourism sector, the tourism businesses, more into biodiversity rather than other sectors. And of course, like I said, our footprint of tourist arrivals in the country, this was a major discussion, an area which we discussed in reference to getting more contribution from our visitors coming in. And the proposal, one of the other two proposals, was to have a new environment levy, disembarkation fee for cruise ship, every single cruise ship passenger, an additional fee of $20 for cruise ship passengers, as well as $10 for every single passenger that will be arriving via the airports through air travel. So again, this is something that we were hoping to work on during the year, this year, with the different authorities, with the private sector. COVID-19 obviously has brought a whole new challenge for us now, as a small country. Our national budget has had to be readjusted to cater for COVID-19 response. And we have to continue forging ahead with these recommendations for the benefit of biodiversity conservation for this year, as well as the years coming ahead. Finally, in reference to biosecurity, as I've mentioned, this again was a top priority for us to look into, gaining more revenue in terms of biosecurity measures to contribute towards more upkeeping and conservation and safety for the biodiversity. And this has been actively been worked on by our biosecurity agency to raise this extra revenue for biosecurity, and as well as the objectives when it comes to biodiversity conservation. one of the key outputs, which again, Achim Steiner mentioned in his remarks, was the formation of the BFU, the Biodiversity Finance Unit, within the ministry responsible for environment. This has been a success because we've managed also to get the first staffing for this unit, and this unit will be key for the country moving forward. Amongst all the challenges that we have globally, as well as, like I've mentioned, the national circumstances, the economic challenges that we now face nationally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This BFU will work very closely with all the different stakeholders in moving all these recommendations forward. And also,
I think that we are losing the voice from the secretary, but we need to continue with the rest of the conference. And well, thank you very much for being with us, especially the State Secretary Von Poisson and Alain de Coumarmont, the Principal Secretary of the Environment in Seychelles. It is true that biodiversity is the new frontier of sustainable finance. We hear from our colleagues that we need to reactivate the tourism activity, the food system, and biodiversity is key for that. So thank you very much for your words. Before I pass the baton to Simon Buckle, let me just to recognize the extraordinary effort made by the OECD and BioFin teams led by Katja Karusakis and Ono van den Heuvel, and also say hello to Mariana Bellota and my former BioFin colleagues from Mexico. I was in charge of that program many years ago. So I'm very happy to see you all here, healthy and safe. And now it is a time to continue with the next step of this conference. Please, Simon Buckle, the head of the Climate, Biodiversity and Water Division at the OECD Environment Director, will take the floor. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much indeed, Rodolfo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody else who's on the call. And I notice we're well over 200 participants, so it's really exciting to see that at this first virtual global forum. And it really is a pleasure to moderate this second session, which is really going to now begin to dive into some of the more technical aspects, but also offers a good opportunity, which I hope you'll all take, to become more interactive. I know that the problem with these virtual conferences is sometimes it seems that people are talking at you. So we're going to try and make sure that you get a good chance to interact and get your views across. And we can do that in a few ways, either by raising your virtual hand on the system in the chat, in the participants list, or by raising your hand physically, and we'll have people looking to see who's wanting to raise questions. And we'll unmute you as well if you want to make an intervention like that. So we can relay questions for you, or you can do it directly, and we'll try and do a mix of that to jazz up the format a little bit. But before we get to your bit, we wanted to have two short presentations, and we've got a speaker both from the OECD, Edward Perry from the OECD Biodiversity, Land Use and Ecosystems Programme, the Blue Programme that you've heard about. And he's going to give a quick overview of biodiversity finance landscape. And then we've got Jeremy Eppel, who's well known to the OECD, but is a member of the CBD panel of experts on resource mobilization, so quite a critical role this year. And he's going to present the panel's findings on resourcing the CBD Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020, progress and challenges. So that's really going to set the stage, I think, to give a good platform, if you like, for the questions and discussion and comments that you will all be thinking of as we go through this. Particularly want to hear about national experiences and how we can move things forward in the next biodiversity framework period. So let me, without any further hesitation, ask Edward to load his presentation, and we'll get started with his talk, which I hope is going to take no more than about 8 minutes. So if you can keep to that, Edward, that will be great, because we need to keep some time at the end for people to ask questions and comment. And the first thing I'll do when you've done your presentation is quickly ask if there are any technical clarificatory comments. Is there anything that people have not understood? If there's nothing, we'll move straight into Jeremy's presentation, and then we'll do the same. But we won't take substantive questions and discussion until both presentations have happened. So over to you, Edward.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure today to present on behalf of both the OECD and also UNDP BioFin. In this conference, we will discuss priorities for biodiversity finance for the upcoming decade. To do this, it's helpful to first reflect and take stock of where we are today. The key question is, how much do we spend on biodiversity? Now, that's not an easy question to answer. The global biodiversity finance landscape is complex. It involves multiple public and private actors who may be the source of biodiversity finance, an intermediary, or the implementer of a biodiversity action. And to mobilize and channel finance towards biodiversity, these actors can draw on a range of finance instruments, such as subsidies, debt and equity, and also mechanisms such as payments for ecosystem services and biodiversity offsets. Gaps in data and reporting make it difficult to assess expenditure at any one point on this finance value chain. So that's why in OECD's new report, a comprehensive overview of global biodiversity finance, we've pieced together available data from across the entire finance value chain. We estimate global biodiversity finance to be about 78 to 91 billion US dollars per year. Now, public domestic finance makes up the lion's share. Data from 81 governments, including almost all G20 and OECD countries, puts domestic finance at just under 68 billion per year. Public international finance, predominantly bilateral ODA, official development assistance, accounts for about 5 to 10% of this total expenditure. And our private finance estimate, is 6.6 to 13.6 billion. And this covers a range of things such as sustainable forest certification, philanthropic funding, payments for ecosystem services, and also the private finance leveraged by public interventions. So interventions by, for example, the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. So we're spending about 78 to 91 billion dollars per year on biodiversity. Meanwhile, governments alone are spending at least 5 times as much on harmful subsidies. Things like fossil fuel subsidies and some forms of agricultural support. The biodiversity challenge is therefore, the biodiversity finance challenge rather, is therefore not just about scaling up finance for biodiversity. It's also about reducing these harmful flows to biodiversity. And through our analysis, it became clear that there are a lot of initiatives underway to improve data and information on biodiversity expenditure. And we'll learn more about this in the second session later today. That said, we see that there is still plenty of room to improve assessment, tracking, and reporting of biodiversity finance flows and put forward 5 key recommendations. Allow me to highlight just 3 of these. So firstly, we think that the transparency, consistency, and comparability of the data reported to the CBD could be stronger if countries were to report by category. So for example, national government budget, local government budget, private sector, rather than just providing a single aggregate number. I also think they could provide more information on the underlying methodology. We recommend moving towards an internationally harmonized approach for assessing and tracking biodiversity finance, building on existing frameworks and classification systems. And thirdly, it's just as important to track the harmful public expenditure. And the OECD is currently developing guidance to help countries identify and assess harmful subsidies at the national level. Please do tune in next week at the same time to learn more about this. Beyond expenditure, it can also be informative to assess and track progress in the use of positive incentives. The OECD has just launched an update to tracking economic instruments and finance for biodiversity, which covers things like biodiversity relevant taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits, and also positive subsidies for biodiversity. We're soon going to be adding also data on biodiversity offsets and payments for ecosystem services. Currently, 110 countries provide us with this information, and we would invite you and encourage you, other countries, to also provide your information. This data is then used to track progress towards Aichi Target 3, for example, and also SDG 15.8.1 on biodiversity finance. Now, if we look back over the last decade, one of the most important new trends has been the development of national biodiversity finance plans. 30 countries have applied the UNDP biofin methodology through a collective piloting process, and they've fed the lessons learned back into the biofin workbook. So these countries now have data on their existing finance mechanisms, data on how much they're spending on biodiversity, and also, very important, how much they actually should be spending on biodiversity to achieve their biodiversity objectives. And then all this really valuable baseline information is then integrated into these national biodiversity finance plans. Across these 30 countries, approximately 200 new finance solutions were identified to be implemented through these finance plans. And these solutions are not just about generating more funds. They're also about using existing funds more effectively and about realigning existing flows with critical priorities. And it's not just about these big numbers and fancy solutions. The biofin process is also about getting people together and creating a shared vision and action agenda. So bringing together, say, the Environment Ministry with the Finance Ministry and the private sector. Biofin has also mapped all the finance solutions globally available to us today, and the product is the catalogue of biodiversity finance solutions. They have identified over 160 of these solutions, which can be categorized into 67 categories, as you see in front of you. I won't go into detail here, but the point is we do have already a lot of finance solutions available to us. So it's really about finding the right mix for the right place. You'll see here mechanisms that we have been drawing on for some time already, things like debt for nature swaps, conservation trust funds, for example, but also other mechanisms and financing solutions that have been less explored so far. Things like remittances or using green bonds for biodiversity, or a particular favorite, conservation license plates, where car owners pay a premium to get a wildlife image on their license plate. And that's something that Thailand is currently doing. To conclude, allow me just to encourage you to check out our publications, the OECD and UNDP publications in front of you. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to flag a couple of other initiatives underway. The first is Financing Nature, Mechanisms and Policies to Close the Global Biodiversity Funding Gap, which is work being led by TNC together with the Paulson Institute and Cornell University. and the other is the Little Book of Investing in Nature, a simple guide to financing the New Deal for nature. And that is something being delivered by the Global Canopy Program, GCP, in partnership with Cornell University and other organizations. So keep a lookout for these forthcoming reports. I'm sure they're going to be extremely interesting and also useful as we move towards the post-2020 agenda and a strong resource mobilization strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward, for that presentation on behalf of both UNDP BioFin and the OECD Blue Team. Now, I'm just looking to see if there are any quick technical questions or clarificatory questions. I don't see any. So I think we are safe to move straight on to Jeremy. So if we can get Jeremy's slides up on the screen, that would be really, really good. And we're only running a few minutes late, which I knew was going to be a risk in this session, but we should still have enough time for questions at the end and a discussion at the end. So while we just wait for Jeremy, okay, that looks as though the slides are loading nicely and we can move ahead. So Jeremy, let me invite you to take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, that's good for me. Anyway.
Great. Good morning, midday, afternoon, everyone. I'm in London, so it's the middle of the morning here. Very, very nice to be involved in this conference and very glad grateful to the OECD and UNDP BioFin for making it happen in these difficult times. I'll try and be brief, but I do just want to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing as what are called an expert panel of experts on resource mobilization that the CBD has created to support the work this year on resource mobilization towards the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We're a panel of three. There's myself, Tracy Cumming in South Africa, well known to BioFin, and Jascha Pfefferholz, a colleague from Chile who's an economist. So the three of us have a mandate from COP14, that's the one that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh in November 2018, to prepare three key reports. The first of them is the one I'm mainly going to talk about today, which is a review of experiences and evaluation of the current CBD strategy for resource mobilization. The second is an estimation of the resources that will be needed to implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. That, of course, is as yet a moving target, but the estimations look at a range of possibilities. And thirdly, and importantly, looking ahead, is a contribution from the panel to the resource mobilization component of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework itself. And there was part of our mandate is to ensure that the resource mobilization issue is fully integrated into that post-2020 framework. We were established only in October last year, and there was a call for evidence from the CBD Secretariat that was well responded to. We've had a series of expert meetings, individual meetings. There was a global consultation which took place in Berlin in January. A number of you were probably involved, and then some regional and sub-regional meetings and other discussions. So we have tried to fulfill our mandate to be as inclusive and stakeholder inclusive and friendly as possible in undertaking our work. I'm very pleased to say that all three reports, both in complete form and in summary form, are now completed, and subject to the CBD processes, they will be posted in not many weeks' time. So you will all be able to see those. They are intended to be considered formally at the subsidiary body of implementation meeting, which has of course been postponed now from the end of May to the end of August. I want to focus today on the first report, the more backward-looking report, but it does also have pointers for the future, as our mandate included looking at further action that would be needed to meet any of the shortcomings of the previous strategy. What did we find? We found that the strategy for resource mobilization, which was established early in the last decade, is still essentially sound. The people who thought about it at the time had basically got the right ideas, had got the right concepts, and had characterized the strategy in the right sort of way. But there are real questions, and this came out very strongly from our evidence gathering, about how effective it has been operationally, especially in developing countries. There have been real challenges in implementation, and I think this is no surprise to any of us, there is, and certainly historically, been a lack of priority for the issue of biodiversity outside environment ministries. So that issue of mainstreaming, not my favourite word, but I think we all know what it means. The issue of removal of harmful subsidies that Edward's already touched on in relation to HE Biodiversity Target 3, and ABS, access and benefit sharing, another key part of the CBD agenda. They're all very relevant to resource mobilisation. We can't do this in a vacuum. Those all need to be seen as part of the issue and fully integrated into the goals going forward. There are other gaps and shortcomings too that we detected in the previous strategy for resource mobilisation. The issue of the private sector and biodiversity finance, not clearly and explicitly defined, and over-optimism about how much the private sector could contribute. I think we've seen from Edward's presentation just now that it is not the biggest part of the cake. And a number of other shortcomings that we've addressed thinking about the future, how we could improve the strategic framework in which biodiversity resourcing is conceived of going forward. In addition to that strategy for resource mobilisation, many of you will know that there were also a number of specific numerical targets agreed to at CBD COP12. That was in Pyeongchang in the Republic of Korea in October 2014. These were difficult to agree, but were eventually a consensus basis. And several of those had deadlines in 2015. And I'm pleased to say that on the first one, which was a difficult one to finalise, the doubling of international financial flows, the target itself has been exceeded. The target was to double those flows by 2015 and to maintain that at least to 2020. We've yet to see if that maintenance will have been achieved. But by 2015, at least the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD member parties, so parties to the convention in the DAC, beat this target with a 130% increase. There's been moderate progress on the second of those targets, which was to include biodiversity into national plans, some inclusion in 2/3 of cases, and only full inclusion in 1/3 of cases. Reporting on domestic spend was the next target, and 75% of that target, 75% of those reported didn't manage to meet it for all targets, but there was some reporting and some coverage. So that's an area that needs further thought in the future. And preparation of national finance plans, the fourth target, one that we've also just been hearing about from Edward. Actually, only a quarter of those CBD parties that reported had elements of a finance plan, and 2/3 of parties reported that they didn't have the resources to do it. Now, it's not hugely expensive in overall terms to do a plan, but it takes some commitment and it takes some resources. So that's an issue that also needs to be thought about. And then understanding the mobilisation of domestic resources to reduce the gap towards those needs. There's some positive trends seen there, but assessment will be difficult. So the question of reporting, which was also touched on, is also one we see as quite critical going forward. So that's how we assess progress on those targets. There's much more detail in the reports, but that's just an overview. So what do we see looking ahead, coming out of that assessment, as the really key things to think about in the future? We see the need, first of all, to focus attention now on 3 complementary components of resource mobilisation, not to see resource mobilisation solely as about increasing additional resources funding biodiversity, but as already touched on again, so very helpfully identified in the OECD's latest analysis, the need to redirect or reduce resources which are causing harm to biodiversity. They may be explicit expenditure, public or private, or they may be perverse incentives which are causing harm through means that we did not intend. Secondly, it is still vitally important to generate further additional resources from all sources, public, private, domestic, international. And critically, it's important to use all those resources as efficiently and effectively as possible. And that needs some thought and some capacity in many, many places. Secondly, we think, and again, this was touched on by the French State Secretary, the need to enhance the synergies between the resources that are mobilized from all those means for biodiversity and those being mobilized for climate change and for other sustainable development goals more generally. We need to ensure that there are no perverse consequences, unintended consequences of that expenditure, that climate and other sustainable development expenditure doesn't have unintended harm for biodiversity. And we need to think about integrating biodiversity finance comprehensively into the broader sustainable finance agenda. That's linked to mainstreaming again, where the need to make sure that biodiversity is taken into account in the plans, budgets, and actions, not only of the public sector, but also the private sector, and at both national and international levels, is seen as a priority. And finally, we see a number of other things that need to happen. We recognize, as Edward's presentation brought out very clearly, that domestic resources are very, very important, and they'll continue to be so. We can't overlook that important part of the equation. But we do need to think harder about the private sector and the business sector. And that includes the financial sector. So we need both to scale back finance that is harmful to biodiversity and increase biodiversity positive finance or biodiversity enhancing finance. But we certainly need to improve and probably standardize the measurement, management, and monitoring of business impacts on biodiversity to allow the finance sector to make appropriate and objective investment decisions that support our biodiversity goals. Now, in all of this, the governments can't take a back seat. There's a strong role for governments to lead by example and really to create the kind of enabling framework, show leadership that will allow other actors to play their part. In all of this, it's important to ensure that we develop the right capacity at all levels: international, national, local, regional. Practical support will be needed for that to scale up these efforts, including for developing the kind of national biodiversity finance plans we just heard about, and for reporting on resources in the way I've identified. So these are some of the things that we think going forward our assessment has identified as important priorities, and we look forward to working very closely with the OECD, with BioFin, and with many of those who I know are on this call, and we're very glad so many people are, as we go forward through this year. I think the fact that we do have a little more time is an unintended benefit, but one we should really capitalize on. We can do a lot virtually. We can really try and drive this agenda to something extremely well thought through and positive when we finally get to COP15. Thank you very much.